Cyrene is the first character to ever have a kit that specifically names other characters in her abilities. She is specifically made for the Chrysos Heirs. So, if she's going to be a Chrysos Heir specific support, it stands to reason that she should be far and away the best support for them, right? After all, if she isn't bringing something to the team, there's no reason for her kit to specifically name each and every Chrysos Heir in her abilities. I've done hours upon hours of testing for Cyrene and the main teams of each of the Chrysos Heirs, running the numbers for how she compares to their current best teams. So today, I will share with you a tier list of which Chrysos Heirs are benefiting the most from Cyrene, and which of them are getting the short end of the stick. And while most of the Chrysos Heirs have something positive to say about Cyrene's addition to their teams, there is one Chrysos Heir who Cyrene actually downgrades instead of upgrading. Go ahead and take a guess as to who it is before we get started. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. If you need a reminder of what each of Cyrene's abilities do for the Chrysos Heirs, watch my first impressions video for a breakdown of her kit. Otherwise, let's get into the tier list. Please keep in mind that all of this is taking into account E0 S1 characters only. If Eidolons are taken into account for anything here, I will bring it up. Also note that while my testing did include Cyrene's Light Cone isn't nearly as good as it might seem. You see, in order for her to get the crit damage buff as well as maximizing the vulnerability debuff, she needs to use her Memsprite's attacking skill. However, in so many of her teams, it's not worth it to use this skill because you need to save her Memsprite skill to buff one of the Chrysos Heirs instead. As such, oftentimes, Cyrene's Light Cone is giving 10% vulnerability and that's it. It just isn't getting anywhere near its full effect. Also, please note that this is taking into account Cyrene's early beta version. If she receives changes later in the beta, I'll cover those as well, but I wanted to make a video discussing how she's performing for each Chrysos Heir in her current state, so people can know roughly what needs changes and what doesn't. So, we're going to talk about each Chrysos Heir in chronological order of when they were released, just to keep things organized. Of course, this means Aglaea is the first one to talk about. Aglaea's buff seems like one of the strongest at first glance. 70 energy, which is the exact same amount Sunday gives, as well as 72% damage bonus, and a whopping 36% defense shred. These damage buffs are permanent, by the way. The only part that goes away after one use is the energy. In a vacuum, the buffs Cyrene provides Aglaea are really strong, and if these buffs just came for free, Cyrene would easily be the best in slot in Aglaea teams with no question. Unfortunately, these buffs do not come for free. Talking about Aglaea first is good, because it allows us to dive straight into one of the common issues Cyrene has in most of her teams, ramp up time. Cyrene needs 24 stacks of recollection to activate her ultimate, and until she's activated her ultimate, she's sort of just sitting on the team looking pretty and guzzling every single skill point available while moving at 200 speed, desperately trying to get her ultimate so she can actually start being useful. And even when you do all this, Cyrene usually only gets her ultimate at the very end of the first cycle. Sure, once that ultimate gets activated, and she activates the entire team's ultimates, as well as starts providing her specific buffs for the Chrysos Heirs, she starts pulling her own weight. But what I've found is that, unless you're in very favorable matchups for the Chrysos Heirs, Cyrene's immense ramp-up time makes it nearly impossible to clear the first wave in the first cycle, because she just takes too long to start doing anything useful. If you need a reminder of what Cyrene provides when she doesn't have her ultimate, all Cyrene provides is 20% true damage and 40% damage bonus. People see true damage and immediately go nuts for it, but just for reference, these buffs that Cyrene has at a baseline are worse than Jiaoqiu's, and Jiaoqiu clearly is not seen as the pinnacle of buffing by any means. So, a Cyrene without her ultimate active is just a worse Jiaoqiu who guzzles the team's skill points, and that's basically what Cyrene is for the entire first cycle of a team's rotation. Now, for some of the Chrysos Heirs, this isn't the biggest deal in the world because their team is still doing a bunch of useful stuff even while Cyrene is in her ramp-up period. However, this is not the case for Aglaea. You see, Aglaea also has ramp-up time where she needs to build up her ultimate within the first cycle. Therefore, in Aglaea teams, so much of the first cycle is spent just tickling the enemy and ramping up both Aglaea and Cyrene's ultimates. There are a few ways you could attempt to solve this, but they all come with drawbacks. For instance, you can keep Sunday on the team, which completely solves Aglaea's ramp-up time, but then Cyrene loses the 3 extra recollection stacks at the start of of battle due to having one less Chrysos Heir on the team. You can kick Sunday out for a Chrysos Heir support, such as Tribbie, to help Cyrene's ramp-up time, but then Aglaea's ramp-up time becomes even more of an issue with no Sunday to help her. You can go the middle ground route by using RMC, who is the Chrysos Heir for Cyrene, and also has an action advance to somewhat help alleviate Aglaea's ramp-up time, albeit not as well as Sunday's energy. This is a nice compromise between both ladies' ramp-up times, but in the end, the issues with pairing these two together just ended up making a lot of these teams perform very similarly. The first cycle never feels good to play while trying to handle both Aglaea and Cyrene's need to ramp up their ultimates. And then, this is something we'll need to discuss more later, but if you aren't using one of the Chrysos Heir sustains, aka Hyacine or Heng Permancer Terai, good luck, buddy. It just feels so bad if the sustain isn't doing anything to help Cyrene, given how demanding Cyrene's playstyle is. She demands the entire first cycle revolve around her and getting her energy, and that means Aglaea isn't getting energy from Huohuo either. Now, with all of this said, once this team gets going, you can definitely feel how powerful Cyrene's buff for Aglaea is. The damage is really nice, and the energy is actually enough for Cyrene to mostly help Aglaea cycle through her ultimate just fine, even without Sunday. At least for the first few cycles, thanks to Cyrene immediately getting 2 usages of her ultimate, meaning she has 140 energy saved up for Aglaea, just ready and waiting. So, despite all the issues with her playstyle and ramp-up time, Aglaea still starts us off with a very steady B tier, a notable upgrade. In terms of power level, Cyrene increases Aglaea's damage by a noticeable amount, but the first cycle of this team does not feel good to play at all. Still, if you can work around these issues and get the team going, Cyrene helps Aglaea reach higher highs than her current teams. I am now realizing that I forgot to include Remembrance Trailblazer or RMC, who technically released before Aglaea, so let's talk about them as well. A lot of people were expecting Cyrene to be the replacement to RMC, similarly to how Fugue was meant to be a replacement for Harmony Trailblazer, but this isn't quite the case. RMC actually pairs well with Cyrene due to being the only Chrysos Heir with a 100% action advance. This means RMC is one of the best units to help Cyrene with her ramp-up time if you time their action advance to give Cyrene more turns. And while this does mean you're wasting the true damage buff on Cyrene, who doesn't provide much personal damage in most of her teams, there's some really neat synergy between these two, where RMC uses the first mem action advance on Cyrene, and then once that helps Cyrene get her ultimate, Cyrene's ability to instantly activate RMC's ultimate means RMC will get enough mem charge to give the true damage to your main DPS anyway, so it actually doesn't end up being much of a waste giving the first mem buff to Cyrene. Due to this synergy and RMC's ability to speed up Cyrene's ramp-up time, RMC also goes in the B tier for a notable increase. For a free unit, the fact that they're still one of the best partners alongside Cyrene is really impressive. And then, of course, I'll mention the fact that you can play a DPS-focused RMC since Cyrene's buff for RMC focuses on RMC's personal damage as well as Cyrene's own damage. But I'm going to be honest, even in teams that focus on RMC and Cyrene's damage, most of the damage was actually coming from Tribbie. Still, it's technically something you can do now for fun, and it isn't unviable by any means. Speaking of Tribbie, she is up next. This one is a bit complicated, as there are a lot of things to consider, so I'm going to put Tribbie straight into C tier for depends on situation before we talk about it. Most of the time, you're probably never giving Cyrene's buff to Tribbie. Tribbie's buff only buffs her personal damage, and unless you're in a really long, extended fight where Tribbie's damage really matters, like in Pure Fiction, it's usually much more beneficial to save Cyrene's buffs for the main DPS Chrysos Heir. Additionally, there are a few teams where Cyrene's place on the team is replacing Tribbie, namely for Castorice teams. For these reasons, Tribbie isn't going to go super high on the list. However, there are teams where these two are one of the default pairings, such as for Aglaea or for Evernight, where using these two together leads to the biggest damage potential, even though Tribbie doesn't help Cyrene's ramp-up time as much as RMC. So, in these situations, these two do make a good pairing. Not necessarily because they synergize well with each other, since Cyrene isn't even always using her buff on Tribbie, but just because they're both very powerful supports. So, there are pros and cons to Cyrene and Tribbie's pairing, but the actual reason I dropped Tribbie down to this tier is for one major reason: Tribbie's E1. It's not that Tribbie's E1 is bad with Cyrene. Obviously, in the teams where you use them both together, it's great. The problem is that, for some teams, namely one team, Tribbie's E1 is actually a bigger increase than Cyrene, even though Cyrene is supposed to be replacing Tribbie. Obviously, I'm talking about Castorice. And I know we're supposed to be going in chronological order, but we sort of have to talk about Castorice now, since we're already on the topic. So, in a vacuum, Cyrene is Castorice's new best teammate at E0. Her buff for Castorice is a lot stronger than you might think, since it's an additive multiplier, not a damage percent buff. And being able to overcap for higher multipliers is just really comfortable to not waste any stacks of new bud, especially in single target scenarios, since that's where the buff scales even harder. Additionally, Cyrene builds high HP and has a mem sprite who also has high HP, offering more stacks for Castorice compared to Tribbie. She also just synergizes well with the rest of Castorice's team due to being a remembrance character, which Evernight loves. For all these reasons, Castorice at least needs to go in the B tier with Aglaea, where Cyrene is a notable increase in her teams. The reason I can't put Castorice into the A tier, where Cyrene is the definitive best in slot for her, is because of what I mentioned earlier. Tribbie's E1 suddenly kicks Cyrene out of the team again. If Castorice players have her current best team, and they're looking to invest further in the team, they're better off investing in Tribbie's E1 instead of investing pulls into Cyrene. It also goes without saying that Evernight is a bigger upgrade over RMC compared to Cyrene, so unfortunately, Cyrene ends up being the last thing you consider when upgrading your Castorice team at the current moment. If you're only interested in investing into E0 characters, then yes, Cyrene is the best for Castorice. But since there are investment pathways that cause Cyrene to get kicked out of the team, I can't justify putting Castorice into the A tier, and certainly not the S tier. And that's also why Tribbie is lower on the list. While she pairs perfectly fine with Cyrene, I did want to acknowledge that in one of Cyrene's main teams, further investment into Tribbie actually just ends up fully kicking Cyrene out of the team. Again, this is only for the current early iteration of Cyrene's kit. I expect Cyrene to receive some changes over the course of the beta, but for now, she's a tentative increase for Castorice, but not enough of an increase to compete with E1 Tribbie when the two of them are competing. Now then, back to chronological order, we have Mydei. At first glance, Mydei's buff seems very underwhelming. It's one Godslayer, and he gets 60% crit damage only for that Godslayer attack. It's not even a permanent 60% crit damage or anything like that. It seems way less valuable compared to the permanent 72% damage bonus and 36% defense threat that Aglaea gets, right? I think to some degree, it's fair to find Mydei's buffs underwhelming. He's also not particularly fast at charging Cyrene's ultimate, although he doesn't have quite the same issue as Aglaea, where Aglaea is also useless while ramping up her energy in the first wave. Mydei is at least still capable of doing damage while waiting for Cyrene's energy to charge, and once Cyrene does get her ultimate, she allows Mydei to instantly unleash back-to-back Godslayers. So, even though Mydei's damage is rather backloaded with Cyrene, since he's mostly just waiting for her to give him the on-demand Godslayers, it actually ends up being much stronger than you might think. Mydei goes all the way in the A tier. Cyrene is undoubtedly his best in slot support. There was no scenario where Mydei performed even close to better with other supports over Cyrene. However, I do want to be upfront that I don't think this is necessarily because Cyrene has insane synergy with Mydei. Rather, I think the reason Cyrene is Mydei's definitive best in slot support is simply because Mydei hasn't gotten any teammates dedicated to him, ever. Hoyo has left Mydei mains to starve, and any supports that Mydei uses just happen to be powerful general supports, such as Sunday and Tribbie. It's for this reason that Cyrene, who is one of the first supports ever made with part of her kit dedicated to him, ends up being his definitive best in slot support, even if her buffs don't seem all that insane for him. We already discussed Castorice, so let's go to the next Chrysos Heir, Anaxa. Cyrene gives Anaxa a lot of stats: an instant action advance, 40% skill damage bonus, and 60% attack, and she increases the amount of bounces that his skill does from 5 to 8. And this buff lasts for an entire turn, meaning he can utilize these buffs for multiple casts of his skill when paired with Cerydra. There's even a strategy where you can use Cyrene's buff on Anaxa's turn, and it won't waste the action advance. Instead, it'll immediately action advance Anaxa's next turn, while still allowing his current turn to also get all the buffs, essentially extending the buffs for an additional turn, which is really strong and really helpful to make sure he lines the buffs up with Cerydra's double skill. With all of this in mind, Anaxa at the very least makes it to the B tier. Cyrene is essentially the Sunday replacement in his teams, and while her action advance isn't quite as consistent as Sunday's, her buffs are very strong when lined up with Cerydra for Anaxa's skill. The reason I'm not placing Anaxa in the A tier is for a few reasons. First off, Sunday's synergy with Heng PT makes it so that Cyrene isn't as huge of an increase as she can be for other teams, even though she does generally perform better than Sunday. Secondly, Cyrene's strength with Anaxa heavily depends on being able to line up her buffs with Cerydra's double skill. This requires somewhat good planning and good gameplay, and if you mess it up too many times, you aren't maximizing the full value of Cyrene's buffs, which would end up making her fall back into line with Sunday's performance for Anaxa. So, with those caveats in mind, I'm not listing her as the definitive best in slot for Anaxa over Sunday, but she's undoubtedly a noticeable increase for Anaxa when you play the team well. Not to mention, it's just very satisfying when you line everything up perfectly. Next to release was Hyacine, our very first Chrysos Heir sustain. Cyrene's buffs to Hyacine aren't the craziest thing in the world, but the fact that you don't need to target Hyacine with a buff makes it really convenient. Cyrene gets to buff a different character, and Hyacine still gets the damage buff from Cyrene. When Cyrene does choose Hyacine as the target for her buff, it's just a mere 24 energy, which is nothing crazy. But the crux of Cyrene and Hyacine synergy isn't about what Cyrene gives Hyacine, it's about what Hyacine gives Cyrene. Since Memesprites can always give Cyrene a stack of recollection without needing to wait for Cyrene to take a turn, the fact that Hyacine takes turns so fast and allows Ika to take so many actions causes Hyacine to be by far the best stack generator for Cyrene's ultimate. Not just to ramp up her first ultimate, but also to ramp up all subsequent ultimates to allow Cyrene to give more buffs to the other Chrysos Heirs. Cyrene's existence alone causes Hyacine to become a competitive best in slot, even in teams where she usually wasn't a competitive best in slot, such as in Aglaea and Anaxa teams, simply because she charges Cyrene's ultimate better than any other sustain. Due to this, Hyacine shoots straight up into the S tier, absolutely godly. You can feel the difference when it comes to playing Cyrene with Hyacine and playing without her. It's no wonder they made Cyrene's buff for Hyacine relatively simple, because their synergy at a baseline is already so important for Cyrene that they barely need any further justification to always be paired with each other. After Hyacine, we have Cipher. Cipher is an interesting one, because Cipher herself isn't the definitive best in slot for any of the Chrysos Heirs, and Cyrene inherently wants to be supporting one of the Chrysos Heir DPSs. Now, Cyrene's defense buff for Cipher is fairly nice. The damage percent for Cipher doesn't matter all that much, but the extra defense strat is always nice for teams that are able to stack it. The weird thing about Cipher is that while Cyrene's buff for her is alright, Cipher just struggles to be best in slot for the other Chrysos heirs when competing with the likes of Tribbie and RMC. The team Cipher is the uncontested best in slot in is for characters like Fei Xiao, Archer, and Acheron, and since those DPSs aren't Chrysos heirs, they inherently struggle to synergize with Cyrene. Now, even though Cyrene doesn't offer much in terms of buffing to Fei Xiao or Acheron, her synergy with Cipher does still allow Cyrene to slot into their teams, and Cyrene can give stacks for Fei Xiao as well as for Acheron, as long as you have Cyrene's signature light cone, since it actually does apply a debuff every time Cyrene uses her Memsprite skill to buff an ally. Even though it works due to Cyrene's synergy with Cipher though, these teams aren't necessarily beating out the current best teams for Fei Xiao and Acheron, meaning pairing Cyrene and Cipher isn't enough of an increase to see outstanding results. Not to mention, you need one of the Chrysos Heir sustains on the team to help Cyrene's ramp up issues. So, with all that said, Cipher falls into the C tier. I wouldn't say she's necessarily a downgrade. There actually were some scenarios where I found decent success with Cyrene and Acheron teams when Acheron was on element, thus devaluing Silverwolf's res shred and allowing Cyrene to take her place in pairing with Cipher, but the performance wasn't anywhere near impressive enough to earn Cipher a higher place on the list with Cyrene. Additionally, they do have some inherent anti-synergy, since Cyrene's true damage can't be added to Cipher's damage tally, since that's just how Cipher's kit works, unfortunately. Finally, we arrive at the only Chrysos Heir from patch 3.4, the Deliverer himself, Phainon Keslana. There's a lot to say about Phainon. First off, the buff Cyrene gives to Phainon is by far the biggest in terms of how it affects his playstyle. Allowing Phainon to permanently remain in his ultimate means that core flame stacks are no longer part of his playstyle. Instead, you just get Cyrene to charge his ultimate, and he ideally never exits it. She's also providing a bit of crit rate, which obviously signals that she wants to replace Sunday in his teams, and she adds additional hits of fire damage to his attacks, because why not? So this is a lot, right? The fact that Phainon will no longer have any downtime where he needs to stack up core flame stacks for a second ultimate is huge. Now, he's always in his uptime. This is very comfortable for Phainon, since his downtime could run into survival issues or skill point issues. However, Phainon is actually the first and only Chrysos Heir who is going straight into the D tier. Cyrene is a straight up downgrade for him, kind of. Obviously, we have to talk about Cyrene's ramp up time, but what I'm going to say here probably isn't what any of you are expecting. Cyrene's ramp up time for Phainon actually isn't as abysmal as you think, under a few conditions. There is a very cringe and cursed Phainon rotation that can allow Cyrene to rotate through her ultimate and get Phainon his instant ultimate activation in the same amount of action value as Phainon's current best teams. I won't go over the whole rotation, but basically, it requires you to run Phainon with Cerydra, Cyrene, and RMC, where RMC action advances Cyrene to allow Cyrene to spam her skill for her ultimate, and Phainon is on skill point generating duty where he only basic attacks because he no longer needs to skill because core flame stacks no longer matter. All that matters is giving more skill points to Cyrene. I'll link a showcase of the rotation in the description of this video. So all of this is already very cursed since it gets rid of Phainon's entire gameplay loop to cater towards Cyrene's ramp up issues. But as cursed as it may be, it does work quite efficiently. So the ramp up time actually isn't the issue with this team. The issue is instead much more simple. The damage is just worse than Phainon's current teams. Yep, that's all there is to it. Cyrene's buffing is simply too small. We already covered how her baseline buffs aren't even bigger than Jiaoqiu's with her small true damage and damage percent buffs. In addition to those, she gives Phainon 16% crit rate, which is only there to offset the loss of Sunday in the team, and then she adds the additional fire damage on his attacks. The fact that this additional damage counts as fire damage instead of physical damage actually isn't as huge of a problem as you think it is. Sure, it's really weird and hilarious that it's fire damage just for lore reasons, but so much of the damage percent that Phainon gets in his kit is general damage percent, not specifically physical damage percent, meaning his fire damage percent is actually not even that far off from his physical damage percent. So the problem isn't that the damage is fire damage, the problem is that the numbers are just too small. I tested multiple scenarios, even scenarios that were favorable to Cyrene, but the result was always the same. Cyrene simply performs worse than Phainon's current best teams. The reason for this is simple. Phainon's current best teams don't actually have downtime issues as long as you're rotating through them properly, at least for his first two ultimates. So in fights that only take two ultimates, which is the large majority of current content, the fact that Cyrene's buff for Phainon is balanced around getting rid of his downtime doesn't actually matter, since his current teams already make his downtime between his first two ultimates a non-issue. Even in pure fiction, where Cyrene strictly gets more turns than non-Cyrene teams due to the fixed action value of Cyrene's actions, and pure fiction also having a fixed amount of action value, Cyrene gets 3 extra actions compared to Phainon's current teams, and she even enables 1 extra Cerydra double meteor thanks to those extra actions, and she still isn't able to compete with Phainon's current best teams in 2 ultimate scenarios because her damage buffing for Phainon is simply way too much smaller. However, as soon as you end up in scenarios where Phainon needs more than 2 ultimates, this is where Cyrene's value starts to shine, sort of. Current Phainon teams are immediately going to struggle if they fail to clear within their first 2 ultimate rotations, because the team's SP economy simply isn't built to rotate into a third Phainon ultimate without heavily relying relying on enemy RNG or requiring a lot more turns. Due to this, as soon as you need a third ultimate and you're in a scenario where your current Phainon team struggles to get that third ultimate in a timely fashion, that's when Cyrene pulls ahead, since she completely negates the need to build up a third ultimate. You just stay in Phainon's ultimate anyway. This is mostly relevant in Anomaly Arbitration, where fights can take a lot longer than Phainon is used to. However, obviously in Anomaly Arbitration, Phainon is at much higher risk of dying if he doesn't have Dan Heng sustain, and using Dan Heng means you can't use RMC to help Cyrene's ramp up time, so suddenly her ramp up issue becomes a problem again. So there are always trade-offs when using Cyrene, but despite those trade-offs, Cyrene does end up feeling better for Phainon in Anomaly Arbitration. Now, here's the thing. While Cyrene becomes better for Phainon in scenarios where Phainon needs to take more cycles, this mostly applies to accounts who have Phainon at lower investment. If you want to solve the issue of Phainon taking too many cycles, then you would probably be better off vertically investing into Phainon's Eidolons so he just clears in less cycles, as opposed to pulling Cyrene just so she can help your Phainon as he continues taking more cycles to clear, you know? Due to these reasons, even though there are some scenarios where Cyrene can be an upgrade for Phainon teams, she's just 9 times out of 10 going to be a downgrade, and there are usually going to be better things to invest into for Phainon teams if your goal is to improve him. Therefore, Phainon is in the D tier for Cyrene synergy, not just in terms of performance, but also in terms of playstyle, since she completely gets rid of all of Phainon's mechanics. I cannot believe they designed her Phainon buff the way they did, honestly. Anyway, moving on before I crash out too hard, we have the patch 3.5 Chrysos Heirs, starting with Hysilens. Hysilens is an interesting one because she's inherently tied to the hit with Kafka, who isn't a Chrysos Heir, so that instantly increases the ramp up time that Cyrene will need to do. You can attempt to play Hysilens without Kafka, since Cyrene allows Hysilens to proc DOTs, and you can even build Hysilens hyperspeed to proc DOTs more often, but at that point you're kind of just forcing Cyrene on the team to try and make Hysilens mimic what Kafka can already do. So, with Hysilens and Kafka as mainstays, and with the Chrysos Heir sustain needed, that only leaves Black Swan as a replaceable option for Cyrene, and luckily, Black Swan actually is replaceable, to an extent. It's not a huge difference in terms of performance, in my experience. Each of Kafka's DOT procs will do less damage by losing Black Swan, but Cyrene now allows Hysilens to trigger DOT as well, not only via her skill, but also with the amount of energy she gives Hysilens to spam her ultimate, and Hysilens' ultimate actually has higher DOT proc scaling than Kafka's ultimate. Due to this, Cyrene is able to make up for the loss of Black Swan's damage to be competitive, but she's not outpacing Black Swan by a large margin, or even at all in some scenarios, partially due to her massive ramp up time in the first wave. As a result, she goes in the C tier. It depends on the situation, and I definitely wouldn't list her as a big increase in DOT teams in her current state, unless the hyperspeed Hysilens build actually ends up being better than I'm expecting. Next up is Cerydra. It's a little weird ranking the supports like Tribbie, Cipher, and Cerydra, since Cyrene is also a support, and thus, it mostly comes down to how well they support one of the DPSs when paired together. Cerydra, of course, mostly supports Phainon and Anaxa, and in those teams, she does have good synergy with Cyrene. In Anaxa teams, Cyrene's buff is a really powerful one-turn buff, so Cerydra allows you to utilize all of Cyrene's buffs on one really big Anaxa turn where you time the buffs with Cerydra's double skill. In this sense, the two pair really well with each other. On the other hand, the buff Cyrene gives to Cerydra specifically is just the worst. It gives 30% crit damage to the target selected by Cerydra's skill and 1 stack of military merit after the double skill is used. For Anaxa, this buff is almost never worth using over just saving Cyrene's buffs to keep action advancing Anaxa, unless you're in a very long and extended fight where Cerydra is going to get these extra charges a bunch of times, such as in Anomaly Arbitration. On the other hand, for Phainon, this buff for Cerydra has to compete with the buff from Cyrene's own Light Cone, which activates when Cyrene uses her offensive Memisprite attack instead of her buff and gives the same amount of crit damage as Cerydra's buff, while also doubling her Light Cone's vulnerability debuff from 10% to 20%. In many cases, you would rather use Cyrene's Memisprite skill to attack and activate her full Light Cone buff instead of using it on Cerydra to buff her. Due to this, I'm going to rate Cerydra relatively low on the list, going in the C tier for depends on the situation, right next to Hysilens. Even when you do use her buff on Cerydra, which actually is worth it for Phainon in some scenarios, such as in Pure Fiction, where it's a guaranteed extra meteor compared to his current teams, or in longer fights like an Anomaly Arbitration, Cyrene still struggles to outperform Phainon's current teams, which is part of why Cerydra doesn't make it higher on the list, because even when she does get the buff, it's still oftentimes not even worth using Cyrene on the team to begin with for Cerydra plus Phainon. Finally, we come down to the final two Chrysos Heirs, Evernight and Dan Heng Permanecerai. There were plenty of early rumors about how Cyrene would be a huge increase for Evernight teams, and those rumors were definitely correct. Whereas Castorice teams only have Tribbie that they can replace, which is tougher competition for Cyrene, Evernight's current best teams are using both Tribbie and RMC, and Cyrene much more comfortably replaces RMC to complete Evernight's hypercarry team. I will say, if you're just looking for a single extra 5-star upgrade, you technically can pull an additional Hyacine Light Cone instead and put that on RMC, and then RMC can compete a little better with Cyrene. But in general, I would just recommend Cyrene for hypercarry Evernight, to the point where I would actually put Evernight all the way up in the S tier for godly synergy alongside Hyacine. Her buff for Evernight isn't even actually all that insane, Cyrene. The damage percent is nice, but the extra Memoria stacks cannot really be called a mini E2 for Evernight, since Evernight's E2 gives 2 extra Memoria stacks every time Evernight gets Memoria from any source, whereas Cyrene's buff only gives extra Memoria on Evernight's own skill in ultimate casts. Still, Cyrene just synergizes nicely with Evernight's team in general, and Evernight is also one of the best ways to buff Cyrene's own personal damage, where you end up using Cyrene's Memesprite attack skill a lot, especially compared to the other teams. And last but not least, we have Dan Heng Permancer Terai. As one of the only 2 options for a Chrysos Heir sustain, Dan Heng immediately gains value. So if he's your only Chrysos Heir sustain available, then he automatically becomes your de facto final slot on every single Cyrene team. For this alone, he automatically goes into the A tier. It's not like they have bad synergy either. Her buff for him is pretty decent, giving some damage percent to his bondmate as well as increasing the damage of his dragon, and her instant refill on his ultimate gives him so many stacks of his dragon's attack to begin with, which makes it much easier to have no downtime on Dan Heng's enhanced dragons. And of course, Dan Heng comes with the same convenience as Hyacine, where he doesn't need to be the actual target of Cyrene's Memesprite skill in order to get his buff from her. She can buff the main DPS, and Dan Heng will still get his enhanced effect from Cyrene. So, with all this said, Dan Heng is a great sustain option for Cyrene. The only reason he doesn't reach Hyacine's heights is because Hyacine still charges Cyrene's ultimate faster. Cyrene's bonus ability only allows Memesprites to give her recollection stacks with no downtime. So since Dan Heng's dragon counts as a summon but not a Memesprite, it isn't able to keep up with Hyacine's stack generation. As a result, Hyacine is able to compete with Dan Heng even in teams where she's not buffing the main DPS as much as him, such as in Anaxa or DOT teams. And that's why Hyacine still comes out on top. But on his own, Dan Heng is great with Cyrene and will always be used with Cyrene if you don't own Hyacine or need her on a different team. And that's my first tier list for Cyrene synergy with the Chrysos Heirs. Again, one last time, this is not the end-all be-all list. This is just a very early look at how Cyrene is performing for each of the Chrysos Heirs in her very early iteration of the beta at E0 S1 investment. Cyrene will most certainly be going through changes, and different levels of investment can skew things even further, such as Aglaea Eidolon scaling very well with Cyrene's buffs due to giving Aglaea more energy and defense dread, or such as Tribbie investment being able to kick Cyrene out of Castorice teams. The context and the discussion of each character's placement is more important than their actual placement itself, if that makes sense. Now, with all that said, I do expect Cyrene to go through changes in the beta, and I'll even have a video releasing soon that discusses what I personally would like to see change about her kit, so be sure to keep your eyes out for that. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this, whether it be about Cyrene or other characters, and like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. What are your thoughts on Cyrene's synergy with some of the Chrysos Heirs? Are you disappointed with any of them? Pleasantly surprised with some of them? Comment down below to let me know. And if you have any further questions on some of her synergies with any of the characters listed here, just ask away, and I'll be sure to answer. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see how future Cyrene beta updates shake up her team synergies. But for now, until next time!